Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to have one of my best friends, and first and foremost, actor Yonatan Gabayehu, performing some excerpts from plays, so it's not just me reading lines by myself. This is my third year at Talene, and I love it so much. And one of the things I love the most has been the opportunity to do these lectures and to sort of get to really spend time in a subject that I've had questions about in my own discipline, but haven't had the time to parse. So today I'm going to be discussing adaptation, specifically plays which are adaptations of other plays. So I came to playwriting, I think, relatively late, and perhaps because of this, I nurse a somewhat megalomaniacal fixation with other playwrights. I am fanatically interested in their methods and their motivations and the sources of their inspiration. And in this spirit, I've long found myself curious about what everyone has been getting up to with all this adaptation. I think for as long as there have been plays, seemingly there have been adaptations of other plays. Shakespeare himself was a prolific adapter. King Lear is famously an adaptation of an earlier play titled familiarly King Lear. And I think that theater, perhaps more than any other genre of writing, is just endlessly interested in folding back in on itself. I feel like we're kind of in this ever-expanding dialogue of the netherworld in which living writers are conversing energetically with the dead. Is there feedback that you guys are hearing, or is it just me? Just me. I love that. Great. Okay. It's just for the two of us. Okay. So my own relationship to adaptation is complex and evolving. A few months ago, I told my friend and co-teacher, Adrienne Einspanier, that I wanted to write this lecture because I was just starting to explore adaptation in my own work. And Adrienne sort of laughed in my face and was like, Talene, all your plays are adaptations. And I realized that that is basically correct. My play, The Good John Proctor, is a prequel to The Crucible. My play, Jane Eyre, is inspired by a real Elizabethan England proto-feminist text. And my play, How to Load a Musket, is an adaptation of the verbatim interviews I conducted with historical reenactors. So it turns out I've been out here sneakily adapting for years without really contemplating the form. So I began to wonder, what is this impulse that drives so many of us playwrights to adapt each other's work? Is it to critique it, to celebrate it, to cash in on the name brand recognition, to isolate and explore a particular theme, or to situate ourselves in a story which might in its original form not accurately or at all reflect our own experience? Also, why are certain plays adapted dozens of times over while other plays are left untouched? Also, when we adapt other people's plays, do we owe anything to the writer? Jeffrey Hatcher, who is a playwright who's worked prolifically as an adapter, told me, adaptation is always a betrayal because you're changing what the original writer intended. And I think you can and must betray many things, but you must show fidelity to the core ideas of the play, its thematic concerns, its spirit, where it lives theatrically, and how it lands dramatically. If you adhere to these core elements, then I do think you can cut, change, and betray 1,000 smaller things. I should note for today's purpose, I'm not talking about adaptations of books or movies. I'm not talking about musicals. I'm really honing in on plays which come from other plays. And to that end, I've sort of divided them into three categories: faithful adaptation, conversant adaptation, and challenging adaptation. These are categories I made up. So I define a faithful adaptation as one which adheres with general fidelity to the plot points of an earlier text. This genre applies most commonly to works rendered in translation. Famous plays by non-English speaking playwrights are often adapted by celebrated English speaking playwrights who do not personally speak the language of the original text. Sometimes they do a little bit, but oftentimes they don't. And the idea is that these playwrights will then work with a translator to understand the meaning of the text and create their adaptation, which will honor the original play while bearing some stamp of the adapter's own artistic voice. I think perhaps more than any other, I like this interactive. Do people have a guess as to what playwright I think has maybe the most faithful adaptations? What? Oh, no, sorry, I meant like the original playwright whose plays are adapted. Yeah, Chekhov. Yeah, exactly. I think that is number one. I think he's in many ways, Anton Chekhov, the quintessential playwright's playwright. The deceptive simplicity of his plots, the rich expansiveness of his characters allow for endless variation and interpretation. Sarah Rule spoke of her experience adapting Chekhov's Three Sisters. She said, Usually when I'm asked to work on someone else's material, I have to believe it's better than my material or I wouldn't bother doing it. Otherwise, I'd write my own play. So I start with the premise that Chekhov's better than me, and I will learn from him, and I will have his words in my head for a while. Of course, adapting language that's in translation poses a specific challenge for a playwright. Chekhov wrote he was Russian. Heidi Schreck, who recently adapted Uncle Vanya for Broadway, spoke about this challenge, saying, my first step was to just do a literal translation. I do speak, read, and write Russian, but my first literal translation was really bad. So I started working with a native Russian speaker who also knows the play deeply. Then I took that and started adapting it into my own literal translation. That was when I started to get into really murky territory. Like, what is it to be faithful? Faithful to whom? English has 100 times as many words as Russian. The play is very repetitive, but it doesn't sound that way if you're listening as a Russian speaker because you don't know that there are millions of other possible words. So this begins a series of decisions of like, what am I trying to do here? Paul Schmidt, who's one of the foremost American adapters of Chekhov's work, describes this approach. Chekhov's language is ordinary language, flat, banal, unremarkable. It is this quality that I've tried to make clear in my translations. Annie Baker's adaptation of Uncle Vanya, Chekhov's Uncle Vanya, is much celebrated for the ways in which it retains the distinctive simplicity and naturalism of her own writing in its dialogue. Here's a brief exchange from her adaptation in which Vanya sits in the agony of missing his sister.
My sister, my sweet sister, where is she now? If only she knew, if only she knew.
Knew what?
That it's so much, that it's so, the misery, nothing. After all nothing, I'll go now.
He leaves. I love how simple that is. So Baker reflected on her process of adapting this play that's been adapted by so many other people. She said, there's no shortage of Chekhov adaptations. I did have a crisis like a year ago where I said, why am I contributing another Uncle Vanya to the already enormous stack of Uncle Vanyas in the world? But I actually ended up feeling really good about it through the translation/adaptation process. I realized how completely different mine is from any of the others, and how different they are from each other, and how none of us are actually hitting upon the original. The more there are, the closer we'll get to communicating the original to audiences, which I love. The playwright Hallie Pfeiffer took a less traditional tack to her adaptation of Chekhov's Three Sisters, titled Moscow, 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 Moscow. I think she told me at some point she chose 6 Moscows for maximum annoyance. Speaking of her inspiration and her unique process of adapting, Pfeiffer reflected, in Three Sisters, there was something so inherently millennial about the way these 3 women behave. They're so entitled, so obsessed with their own unhappiness, so unwilling to take any actions to overcome said unhappiness, so cruel, judgmental, and petty, and at the same time so capable of love, compassion, and growth. I thought it would be fun and funny to translate the play into millennial speak, and then start to strip away that stylized syntax. I used several translations and had them open in front of me on my desk and would literally read each of them a line at a time and then filter the words through my demented, warped brain. So at the beginning of Three Sisters, the eldest sister, Olga, is bemoaning her appearance. First, I'm going to have Yoni share a short clip from the Paul Schmidt adaptation.
I've gotten old, I've lost far too much weight. I'm sure it's because of all the girls at the high school. They keep making me so angry. I think if I'd gotten married and could stay home all day long, it would have been better somehow.
By contrast, here is Olga's same speech in Hallie Pfeiffer's adaptation.
I look like shit. But what else is new? I've always looked like shit. Even when I was born, I looked like a little baby-faced turd. Hey, shit! That's what everyone would call me. That's not true, I'm just making a joke. But still, everything about me looks like shit.
So, the other writer perhaps most frequently employed in the field of faithful adaptation, my made-up field, is, of course, Henrik Ibsen, Chekhov's Norwegian contemporary, often referred to as the father of modern drama. The playwright, Amy Herzog, has adapted Ibsen twice for Broadway in the last few years. Her first adaptation was of Ibsen's, I think, most famous play, A Doll's House, the story of Nora Helmer, a wife and mother who has a proto-feminist awakening and at the end of the play leaves her husband and children for an independent life. Herzog's second adaptation was of the slightly lesser-known Enemy of the People, which is Ibsen's take on a man who faces backlash for speaking out about water contamination in his town. Herzog ended up approaching the task of adaptation quite differently for the two plays, despite both being Ibsen. Discussing the liberties she took when adapting Enemy of the People, she said, "There are real changes to the dramaturgy. There's a large character that was cut, and we don't have any children on stage. There are things about characters' backgrounds that are different, and there are characters who weren't in certain scenes that I put them in. Unlike with A Doll's House, which I felt essentially had a perfect play inside of it and just needed a few things to be stripped away, with this I felt, for it to be really legible to us, it needed more construction." She also talked about taking into account Ibsen's the context of his life and where he was when he wrote the play when she made this adaptation. She said he wrote A Doll's House and was celebrated for it, and then he wrote Ghosts and he was pilloried. He was really hurt, and so he wrote this thinly veiled parable about a doctor trying to tell people their town's baths are poisoned and they don't want to listen. So I think there's a totally righteous, heroic story in this play, but there's also a petty rage, and I find that really interesting. So last year, I received a commission to adapt this play, Rossum's Universal Robots. Does anyone know it? Cool. So it was written in 1920 by the Czech writer Karl Čapek. It's commonly referred to as RUR. And it's at once a period piece and a sci-fi thriller. And it's also the origin of the English word, robot, which is taken from the Czech robota, meaning forced labor or servitude. The plot revolves around a factory which mass produces robots who are, in Čapek's rendering, the original kind of idea for this, they are physically identical to humans. And by the end of the play, spoiler, the robots, who have become increasingly advanced and aware of their superiority to humans, mentally and physically, decide to emulate the violent tactics they've observed in people in the world by killing all of mankind. So when I first read RUR, I was struck by how deeply prescient the story felt for a play that had been written over 100 years ago, way before computers or AI. I liked the sort of strange formality of the characters. The humans of the play, especially the men, seemed a lot like the robots in the play. And that confusion felt really interesting to me. I told the theater that I felt the play was so remarkable for its time that the best adaptation tack for me would be to remain faithful to the original text, preserving Čapek's ideas and structure, using language which felt, basically speakable and accessible in my brain. I was following the logic of Paul Schmidt, who said, "I believe most theater texts need continual retranslating. While the language of the original remains fixed in time, the language of every audience changes enough in 40 or 50 years to render a new translation necessary." So to create my adaptation, I was paired with a Czech woman who provided me with a direct translation of the play. And then I sort of went back and forth between her version and a different translation as I navigated how best to interpret Čapek's work. My primary aims were to clarify, simplify, and streamline, and to make the play also as producible and accessible as possible to modern audiences. So I slimmed down the cast by figuring out a convention whereby every human character doubled as a robot character. I created a unity of setting. I made many cuts in places that felt to me to be sort of repetitive or long-winded. And I simplified the ending a good amount because the original felt kind of maudlin to me. And I wanted the dialogue to flow, but I also was thinking a lot about another Amy Herzog quote, which is that a really good translation has a whiff of foreignness, that there's some way that you feel the foreignness of the original. And I think I really wanted to keep just the fact that he wrote it in 1920 was so crazy to me that I wanted kind of like a feeling of that time in the dialogue. I will also own the fact that the process of this adaptation was often frustrating to me. I was delighted by RUR when I first read it, but my work adapting felt frequently similar to my sometimes day job of editing college admissions essays. It didn't feel like when I'm working on my own plays that I'm sort of in an all-consuming vigor. I did not feel that way. I felt like I was like going to the office. And I also sometimes found myself like really annoyed with Chapek. I was annoyed that he wrote this leading female character who's sort of silly and dim-witted in ways that I couldn't seem to alter without tearing up the plot. I felt like increasingly annoyed at the characters who were sort of really long-winded and precious about some of their ideas, even though I was like, but of course these ideas are so revolutionary for the time. And then interestingly, when we had our first workshop with actors, I found that my kind of habitual bone-deep anxiety for when I have a new play workshop was conspicuously absent. I felt no ownership over the play. I felt like I was one voice in a room weighing in on what Chapek had written, and just part of this like collective of people thinking about like, okay, how do we together figure out how to bring this play to life today? That was just one form of adaptation. My next category, conversant adaptation, designates a play which converses with an earlier play through the borrowing of plot events or characters or themes, which are then serviced to bolster a new and different story. So an example of Chekhovian conversant adaptation is the late great Christopher Durang's Vanya, Sonia, Masha, and Spike. This is not an adaptation of any one specific play, but a mashup of names and themes and scenarios from basically all of Chekhov's oeuvre. The setting is a country estate, but instead of rural Russia, we're now in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And the play centers on three middle-aged siblings, Masha, Sonia, and Vanya, whose names are explained early on by Vanya, who comments to Sonia.
It's been our cross to bear that our parents gave us names from Chekhov plays. The other children made such fun of us with our mysterious names. Such was the burden of having two professor parents and so active in community theater as well.
Paul Schmidt observed that Chekhov began his career as a comic writer. Comedy was what he knew best, and Chekhov famously labeled all of his plays, I think with the exception of Three Sisters, as comedies. So I think Vanya, Sonia, Masha, and Spike beautifully splashes around with this quality of Chekhov's writing, the existential comedy at the center of human existence, but then ratchets it up into an absurdist key. Towards the end of Chekhov's The Seagull, the character of Nina, in acute financial and mental distress, keeps repeating the phrase, "I'm a seagull, I'm a seagull." In the next excerpt from Masha, Sonia, Vanya, and Spike, Sonia delivers a diatribe to her brother Vanya, in which Durang is riffing on this famous line from The Seagull, as well as the title subject of The Cherry Orchard.
I know I complain, but in some ways I love it here. It's where I've been since I was 8 years old. I came from an orphanage into a family that either loved me or pretended to. I get confused about that. And it's pretty here. And I love to look at the pond. I love the wild turkeys who wander about the property. I like learning they're so awkward that they sleep in trees but repeatedly fall out of them. I identify with them. I often fall out of my bed, thrashing about in my restless sleep. I am a wild turkey. I am a wild turkey. And I love the cherry orchard in the spring, all the pink blossoms, nature so resplendent.
The cherry orchard? What cherry orchard?
We have 10 or 11 cherry trees. They blossom every spring. Do you not remember?
I remember, but it's not an orchard. You don't call 10 or 11 trees an orchard. Lucas Nath's A Doll's House Part 2 is a very particular example of conversant adaptation, a sequel. Nath's play takes place 15 years after the final beat of Ibsen's original play, when Nora has walked out on her family. His plot is very Ibsen-esque in its drama of actions and their moral consequences. In the play, older Nora has used the independence she fought for 15 years ago by becoming a published author who has written a very popular and meta novel about a woman leaving her husband. Her book has sparked a sort of revolution amongst the women who've read it, and this is in 19th century Norway, which include the wife of a very prominent judge. The judge, outraged, has tracked down Nora's true identity and discovered that she's still married to her husband. He is threatening to expose her as a married woman unless she retracts everything that she's written. And so Nora comes back to her husband to convince him to divorce her for good. The critic Hilton Als wrote of Nath's adaptation, "Nath's work is an irresponsible act, a kind of naughty imposition on a classic, which, in addition to investigating Ibsen's signature play with the humor that the 19th century artist lacked, raises a number of questions, such as what constitutes an individual achievement in this age of simulacrum when everything owes something to something else?" Als also compares Nath's work to the British playwright Tom Stoppard, writing, "Like so many of Stoppard's works, in which historical figures come up against the playwright's irrepressible love of ideas, Nath's script is a kind of metafiction. A Doll's House Part 2 is a play about a play." Stoppard's most famous work of conversant adaptation is, I think, his 1966 absurdist tragicomedy Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are quite small parts. They're childhood friends of Hamlet's who are hired by the king as pseudo-spies to discover Hamlet's secret motivations. Hamlet outwits them by forging a letter which leads to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's deaths off stage. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, it is now Hamlet who is a minor character, while Stoppard investigates the meta-existential state of two men who exist perpetually waiting in the wings, fated for death. The action of Hamlet plays out here, but much of it in the background. The play also owes some inspiration, if not like direct adaptation credit, I think, to Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, another story which explores boredom and purpose through the comedic relationship of two aimless male characters. Indeed, Stoppard's play begins with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern betting on a coin toss 92 times in a row. A very different take on conversant adaptation of a Shakespeare play is G.H. Park's Peerless, a warped and wonderful take on Macbeth. Hopefully this doesn't count as a theater. So Park takes the tale of the murderous Scottish general Macbeth and his ambitious wife, Lady Macbeth, and transfers it to an American high school where two Asian American twin girls, M and L, respectively, resort to violence as they navigate the ruthless world of elite college admissions. Macbeth fights to be King of Scotland, but M and L are fighting for the one minority affirmative action spot at the prestigious unnamed college. Obviously, this is now a period piece. By placing the high stakes of the play in the political landscape of college applications, Park's story is not only more comedic in tone than Macbeth, but it's about something else entirely. She explores the way in which identity can be commodified into a devastating and incisive weapon. The sisters brag about being double minority, referring to their gender and ethnicity, and they're outraged when a white-presenting male from their school scores the affirmative action slot at the college after discovering he's 1/16 Native American. There are no daggers. Murder in Park's story is committed by the vicious manipulation of a tree nut allergy and a withheld EpiPen. The three witches in Macbeth are transformed into a character called Dirty Girl, a white girl who utters prophecies in the schoolyard. The relationship between the sisters and the unnatural tightness of their bond and their brutal ambitions for both themselves and each other is the central relationship of the play. So clearly, the famous dead white man is overwhelmingly represented in the genre of adaptation. My friend Emma Horowitz chose to look elsewhere for inspiration in her play Mary Gets Hers, an adaptation of Abraham, or The Rise and Repentance of Mary, written by the 10th century canoness and first known, though maybe not so famous, at least to me, female playwright Hortsivitha. Abraham tells the story of Mary, a young orphan who falls into a life of prostitution before being saved and redeemed by her uncle Abraham, a monk, and his monk friend, Ephraim. Emma described her early process of engaging with Abraham to me. I pulled up Abraham and thought, what kind of momentum does this little text from the 10th century have to offer? And the answer is quite a bit. The original text moves very quickly, almost without sentiment. The characters are exclamatory and believe what they believe with a comical level of authority. The scenes are quick and sharp and take no time getting to the most dramatic element. There is no time to waste on this earth, Hortsivitha seems to be saying, and I agreed. I got through some more scenes when it occurred to me that I was reading a play that was nearly tailor-made for my personal enjoyment. I felt like I had stumbled upon an unproduced Marx Brothers movie. I deeply recognized the rhythm of this comedy, the dramatic setup of this world, and the two monks who drive its action. I had no idea who Hortsivitha was, having never taken a theater history course before, but was tickled by the idea that there was a woman writing raunchy comedies in the 10th century in order to convince young women to be good Christian girls. So in Mary Gets Hers, Emma made major changes to Abraham, including the beginning and ending of the play. Also, crucially, she specifies that her play be cast with all women and gender nonconforming performers. She describes this casting decision as follows. The verve of this play is inspired by the constellation of girls who I imagine lived at the Gandersheim Abbey, the same girls who Hortsivitha likely wrote Abraham to read or see or even perform themselves with and for each other by candlelight in a dim room, just as Hortsivitha infused this genre with the stylings of Terence's Roman comedies, so have I infused this medieval comic drama with my own heritage as a queer Jewish writer of the 21st century. So here's an excerpt of the scene between the two monks, which I think demonstrates this infusion.
It's just, I'm still so worried. I'm so worried that this poor orphan girl's loveliness and purity has already become ruined by the taint of sin. Or worse, I'm worried that even if her loveliness and purity has not already become ruined by the taint of sin, she will be at great and eminent risk of soon being ruined by the taint of sin if she does not at least become betrothed to God.
She isn't at least betrothed to God?
Which is why I come to you, Ephraim.
But how old is she?
Almost 8.
And you say she is not yet betrothed to God?
Not even a little.
So my last category, challenging adaptation, addresses adaptations which not only incorporate elements from the original play, but actively challenge or critique it, often in a meta way with the original playwright named or referenced explicitly. So take for instance, James Imes' Pulitzer Prize-winning play Fat Ham, another adaptation of Hamlet, which centers on a black family at a cookout in the American South. Imes uses many of the basic plot points of Hamlet, but twists them into a new comedic form. Hamlet is now Juicy, a thick, queer, young black man taking online classes in HR at the University of Phoenix. His father, Pap, was a barbecue pitmaster who went to prison for killing a man. Pap was then killed himself in a hit job orchestrated by his own brother, Juicy's uncle Rev, who promptly married Juicy's mother, Tedra. Sound familiar? Hamlet's play within a play is replaced in Fat Ham by an active game of charades. There's also an amazing sequence in which Juicy sings passionate karaoke to Creep by Radiohead, which is like a pretty classic Hamlet choice of song. And then there's also meta commentary. So take, for example, this exchange between Hamlet and his mother. I'm going to read Juicy, and Yonatan's going to play his mother. The king, my queen, is dead.
Huh?
Is Shakespeare, kind of.
You watch too much PBS.
How can one watch too much PBS?
You don't need to know all that.
And then a little later, they're speaking about Uncle Rev here.
Just be nice.
How nice the quarrel was.
What?
Shakespeare.
If you bring up that old white man one more time, don't nobody want to talk about his ass. You act like he has all the answers. You look crazy out here quoting Shakespeare and shit.
At the end of the play, Imes breaks the fourth wall, and the characters contemplate how to end this story of intergenerational violence with an ending pre-written hundreds of years before. Similar to Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Fatham's characters are at war with a fate already decided for them. Ultimately, Imes challenges Shakespeare and rejects an ending that would inevitably involve a scene of murdered black bodies. Instead, Fatham ends with a party, a celebration of blackness and queerness, with, of course, more karaoke. Brandon Jacobs Jenkins' brilliant An Octoroon is an adaptation of the 1859 hit play The Octoroon by Dion Boucicault. The original play is an antebellum melodrama set on a Louisiana plantation telling the story of an enslaved woman who is 1/8 black, or an octoroon. Jacobs Jenkins' play is in many ways a true example of challenging adaptation. He recreates much of the plot of Boucicault's play, but he also comments upon and explores his own act of adapting in fantastical ways. So An Octoroon begins with an actor playing the role of BJJ, a fictionalized version of Jacobs Jenkins. He stands on stage in his underwear and speaks directly to the audience, recreating both sides of a conversation he says that he's had with his therapist about Boucicault.
Who is that? Oh, he's a playwright. He's dead. He wrote in the 19th century. I've never heard of him. Yeah, no one cares about him anymore. He's dead. So your role model is someone no one cares about. I mean, people cared about him when he was alive. Oh, okay. And what did he write? Well, he's probably best known here for writing this play called The Octoroon. The Octoroon. What's an octoroon? It's a person who's 1/8 black. Ah, and you like this play? Yes. Okay, well, here's an idea. Why don't you try adapting this octoroon for fun? I think it's important to connect with things that you feel positive feelings for. So I did, or I tried to.
Just a few lines later, he fucks with our sense of reality by saying,
Just kidding, I don't have a therapist. You people are my therapy.
Soon after, Boucicault, who is named playwright in the script, enters, also in his underwear, and complains drunkenly to BJJ.
Time is like so fucked up, you know? Why, you ask? Well, first of all, I'm apparently not famous anymore, which sucks. You don't even know who I am.
An Octoroon explores and fucks with the performance of race and identity in dizzying ways. Jacobs Jenkins mixes stilted formal speech from the original play with contemporary dialogue, and especially in the scenes between slave women. The black playwright applies whiteface so he can star as the two white male leads in the original play. Another character, Brer Rabbit, a trickster character from African American folklore, wanders in and out. In the original production, the person in the rabbit suit was Jacobs Jenkins himself, while an actor portrayed the playwright role of BJJ. So Jacobs Jenkins reflected on his process of adapting Boucicault's play. He said, I was interested in how authorship surrounds the discourse of that play historically. An Irish guy wrote a play about American slavery. The rules of who gets to write what always fascinate me. I also walked into that process thinking this racist guy wrote this racist thing a long time ago. This is going to be easy. But the deeper I went, the more my point of view on Boucicault and how he saw himself as an artist changed. A friend of mine once told me that one of the pleasures of the play was seeing me fall in love with him. I needed to figure out how to turn off or make audiences deactivate their sense of power over the play, which was structured by the expectations they walk in with about the kind of play a black playwright might write. What I built into that opener is a playwright, or two playwrights, disappearing into the play. You have to move through Brandon, then Boucicault to get to the thing. The authorship deconstructs itself. Though interestingly, this character is not the author, not me. Everything he says about himself is a lie, and then he tells you it's a lie, which becomes important for entering into a world that keeps shifting. So I tried my first foray into challenging adaptation this past year when I explored an adaptation commission for the 1714 comedy The Wonder, A Woman Keeps a Secret by Susanna Saint-Livre. I was thrilled by the idea of shining a retroactive spotlight on a prolific female playwright who was writing with great success centuries before I had thought of female playwrights existing. But I went in with a really specific intention. When I started to work on Wonder, I had been percolating on ideas for a very specific sort of play, and I felt strongly that Susanna Saint-Livre could help me to write it. I wanted to create a classic ensemble comedy in the style of The Government Inspector or A Servant of Two Masters, which are incidentally two plays written by men that have spawned many celebrated adaptations. I was intent on learning how to write the kind of tight and twisty plot structure that big farce requires. And perhaps most importantly, I wanted the roles for women to be genuinely funny. I've found that there's a sort of strange inverted sexism which occurs in much contemporary comedy, including some of my own earlier writing, which is, I think, in order to avoid writing female characters as sexist stereotypes, playwrights slate the women into sort of like the straight man roles, forcing them to bear the weight of conscience or morality, responding stiffly while the male characters clown around and get the big laughs. So, in adapting Wonder, my primary intention was to create female characters who were every bit as self-absorbed and dumb and disgusting as the men. I think feminism comes in many forms. And I've maybe never enjoyed writing a play so much. I took Saint-Livre's play, which is set in Lisbon in the early 18th century, and I set it in the present day aboard a cruise ship headed from Paris to Portugal. Saint-Livre's plot is centered on the hijinks and misunderstandings between two sets of lovers. I kept much of that plot and most of the character names, but I demoted the lover misunderstandings to the B plot while inventing an A plot about a fantastical art heist. Reading Saint-Livre's play, I was struck that the central theme of the story was not love, but friendship. Isabella and Violante, the two female leads, are constantly jeopardizing their romantic connections, albeit with toxic and childish men, to zealously prove their platonic friend love for each other. And at the end of the play, when they both marry their respective male lovers, I felt pretty disappointed. So I decided that my adaptation would not end with marriage or kissing. I wanted it to be kind of a celebration and exploration of friendship. The lead/audience surrogate in my adaptation of Wonder is a maid named Ines, a lady's maid in the original, and in my play, a cruise ship toilet maid. This is making me think of Jesus' wonderful play about maids. So Ines realizes early on in my play that she has no friends and is wildly lonely. She spends the play doing classic farce maid things, delivering letters, poking into people's business, but it's all motivated from her sort of desperate desire to make friends. Additionally, Ines is aware that she's in an adaptation, and she's often frustrated by it. Saint-Livre begins her play, really, with a rhyming plea to critics to be kind to her. So here is a part of my adaptation of this address at the beginning of the play, delivered by Ines, who has just asked the audience if there are any critics in the house.
I inquire just because, I must now confess, our female playwright is terrified of press. She beseeches the critics to recall her plight. Think how many hurdles hinder women who write. Why, she wrote this poor play while balancing stuff like cooking and baking and cleaning and such, straightening her hair and dumping the trash, plucking her brows while waxing her stash. She spent so much time trying to please everyone, it's a wonder that she has got anything done. Not to mention, she's based the plot of this show on a very old play by some broad you don't know. It's hopeless. 2 women? Please hear my appeals. How can they write plays whilst walking in heels? It just makes no sense. So please give them a break, dear critics, be kind. And for pity's sake, write raves if you write. Raves we'll never forget. If you hate us, that's fine. Just let that be secret. A secret, of course, is a hard thing to keep. It weighs on the soul and haunts over sleep. So I hope you do like us and praise us in time. In exchange, this I'll grant you. It's the last line I'll rhyme.
So, my adaptations of RUR and Wonder have not yet had their first productions, and I'm curious to see how my relationship to adaptation, as well as to these original playwrights, will evolve over time. Right now, Wonder feels like my own play, which Susanna Saint-Livre helped me realize, and RUR feels like Karl Čapek's play, which I have helped him to update. In an email, my friend Emma Horwitz, who wrote Mary Gets Hers, wrote to me, "You meet a pre-existing text with your taste and intuition. The original is made by someone else's taste and intuition. You can assume or guess at the mathematics and crafts they used to get to the thing they created, but there is always the X factor of a writer's idiosyncratic personality, regardless of history or even ability. In this, the process of adaptation is like having a deep conversation with another artist, a dialogue. No one's voice comes out on top. You're just adding to the pile of conversation and opinion and question that others across history have had. But instead of keeping your inquiry to the dinner table, you get to your desk and start writing. Adaptation is the answer to the question, if you could have dinner with any writers, living or dead, who would it be? I would have dinner with all dead writers. And so I have to keep adapting their plays to remain close." Which I think that piece of writing is pretty perfectly expressed. I would never adapt it, but maybe someday someone will. Thank you very much. And thank you to Yoni. It was beautiful.